Thank you everyone for joining us. I think we're not sure if we have another group based in our building who are also trying to join and who have mentioned in the chat they're having some difficulties. So I might go and check on them once we get started. Yes, thank you very much for joining us for this Oxford Water Network webinar on why water risks are becoming a material risk for companies and the challenges of assessing exposure correctly. It's really great to have Jennifer Moeller Gulland here to be speaking today. And so before I give her bio, just a few words on the Water Network. So the Oxford Water Network is an opportunity to collaborate across the university and with external partners particularly for impact. We help to support researchers across the network to meet, to engage, and we have a number of events throughout the year like this one, both in Oxford and online. Our next event is on tomorrow night. We have some drinks for those of you who are in Oxford, and there'll be more information on that at the end of the call. But first, let me take a moment to introduce Jennifer. So it's really exciting to welcome Jennifer back. Jennifer was one of our Water Security Policy Management MSc students a few years back now. And so she is a water risk and economics expert with over 16 years of experience advising the World Bank 2030 Water Resources Group and the United Nations, the European Commission, and many multinational companies. They're of course very relevant to this talk here about that engagement with the private sector. She's worked internationally across over 25 countries on national site level and supply chain water risk assessments. And she's the founder and managing director of Water Security Collective, where she's been working to build a global network of credible water risk experts. She's the developer of the Water Risk Assessment Blueprint, a proprietary framework she teaches, and she's going to share more about this as she goes through this talk now. So thank you very much, Jennifer, for joining us. It's really great to have you here, and I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Katrina, for the nice introduction and for welcoming me back again. It's always lovely speaking to the Oxford Master students on these topics. And I wish I could be there in person. Unfortunately, I couldn't this time, but maybe in the future. So let's start. So today I would like to share about why water risks are becoming more material for companies and the challenges of assessing exposure correctly. And let's just dive straight in, since we're a bit late. Can we please go to the next slide? Can I control the slides? I can't, right? Okay, good. Okay, so why should business care about water risks? Next, please. I would actually start with a quote, which for me really summarizes the conversation quite nicely. A colleague told me water isn't that important because the sector is less than 1% of GDP, meaning the utility sector, right? The problem, however, is that the other 99% can't do without it. And it is a quote from Pete Klopp, who was the head of responsible investments at PGGM Investments. So it just basically says water is incredibly important for all economic activity. Next, please. So how is water important for corporates? Just to take a step back. So water risks can affect companies in two ways, which is also called double materiality of water risks. One is the financial materiality, where we have the water risks actually impacting the operations and the finances of the company. Being, for example, we've got insufficient, unreliable water supplies, which cause operational interruptions. We have a sudden change in water quality increases operational costs. We maybe have a media coverage against a company which damages their reputation. So we have the danger coming from the water risks, from the environment to the company. On the other hand, we have the impact materiality, which is the impact of the business on society and the environment, meaning specifically that, for example, water abstractions can contribute to over-abstraction of the aquifer. We have untreated wastewater discharge, which pollutes water bodies, or we have lack of adequate wash provision, which negatively affects workers. So we have the two ways which water risks can affect corporates. Next, please. And we have 4 main categories which can cause problems for the corporates looking at water risks. We have operational financial risks, which is the most intuitive and the most looked at. It can disrupt business continuity. It can cause damage to assets, for example, from floods. It can lead to high operational costs, for example, higher treatment costs due to water quality issues, increased water sourcing costs in times of water stress when they have to buy maybe water tanked water or start a desalination plant. We have a limited expansion potential due to limited resources and disrupted transport. Now, market risks are the other 3 are less looked at. Like market risks include the higher price volatility of inputs. For example, if there's a drought, my agricultural inputs might be more expensive, which then causes my overall costs of production. Or we might even have supply limitation of input, for example, microchips, as we had in the drought in Taiwan a few years ago. We've got reputational risks, including brand equity impacts from consumer concerns, advocacy campaigns, which we're going to look at an example in a second, loss of legal or social license to operate, and finally, regulatory and litigation risks, which is becoming increasingly relevant as governments are becoming stricter in the regulatory frameworks. So we can look at compliance risks due to violations of regulation, side in the supply chain, and failure to anticipate future government action, for example, looking at increased tariffs, or reallocation of water rights as water becomes more scarce in certain areas. However, we've got the risks, but all these can also be turned into opportunities and new product offerings for the companies who are aware of them and have this entrepreneurial sense of turning these risks into opportunities. So it's not all negative. Okay, next, please. This graph just to show you that the risks I'm talking about aren't like some kind of future projection. That's actually happening right now as we're talking about it. So in 2018, which is quite a while ago, CDP made a study looking at from all the companies which submitted their questionnaires to CDP, which was the former Carbon Disclosure Project. They wanted to understand like what is the actual risk exposure of companies today, or the risks which they believe could generate substantive change in the business today. And we see 26% of the companies submitting the questionnaire reported high operating costs, 25% reported plant or production disruption leading to reduced output, or we have 8% reporting water supply disruption, 6% mentioning constraints to growth. So we have a clear impact and exposure to water risks already in the corporate space. It's not just a future vision, sometime it may happen, right? Next, please. And here just to give you some examples of the different risk categories. So a while ago, not too long ago, I don't know if you remember that Tesla built a battery factory near Berlin, and it was all waved through by the German government until the Social Society organizations started looking more into it and started protesting, and then the government had to revisit if they actually do have enough water in the area, and they found actually we don't have enough water in the area. And Tesla had to stop its production, or they couldn't open the plant. They had to improve the technology used to make it more water efficient, and it cost millions and millions in euros delaying opening the factory. So this is one of the great examples of companies thinking water risks won't affect them because they have a lot of power, but then in the end, it does affect them even if they're not aware of how exactly it could affect them. Next, please. Then we've got a very interesting thing, which or aspect that water shortages can also impact, or water can also impact the transport of global trade. So in 2024, the Panama Canal was extremely low because of less rain than normal, which then resulted in not enough boats or ships.
Okay, I think you're back.
Okay. Yeah, sorry for that. Yeah, we just have a storm here, actually, so it's really affecting internet and mobile data and Wi-Fi. My apologies. Okay,
another water risk. And we'll try and keep it going as best we can. Thanks.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, another water risk, how it affects Wi-Fi. Okay, next, please. Okay, looking at market risks, we have, as soon as we have a drought, for example, Australia, this is a bit outdated from 2020, but it happens all the time, that we have a drought, we have food prices rising, which then increase inflation, but it also increases the cost of inputs for companies. So we see that impact of drought impacting agricultural inputs. Next, please. Then reputational risks. This was a landmark case study, really, and we could say also the birth of corporate water stewardship as we know it today. Coca-Cola wanted to build a factory in Tamil Nadu, which is a state in India. People were protesting, but the government gave the permissions anyway. And later on, the civic opposition was so strong, and they kept on protesting, that Tamil Nadu actually cancelled the construction permit while it was already being constructed, costing Coca-Cola, a huge amount of money. In addition to that, the state trade associations were also telling everybody not to buy any products of Pepsi or Coca-Cola. Pepsi being included just being similar to Coca-Cola, right? So you have a risk not only for your own operations, but also for companies which are similar to yours, where they might think, the same applies to the other companies. So huge reputational risks which companies are facing nowadays. Next, please. And that goes to show that new stakeholder expectations regarding corporate responsibility and now expose company to financial risks based on perception of inefficient or inequitable corporate management of water resources, not necessarily if it's actually true. And that's a very important distinction between looking at the facts, what's happening on the ground, and what is actually perceived by stakeholders. So really increasing the importance of having a stakeholder-based approach and informing everybody and making sure everybody is okay with whatever the company is doing on the ground. Next, please. And just I actually wanted to do a quiz, but I think I can't see anybody's replies, right? So let's just skip to the last slide, like two slides further on. And one further, please. Yeah, exactly. So water risks are going to, one before. Yeah, so water risks are going to increase exponentially by 2050. So today we have 10% of global GDP exposed to high water risks, according to WWF. And in 2050, it's going to be 46% of global GDP. And for population, we have 17% of the population exposed to high water risks today and 51% by 2050. So we can see a very strong increasing trend in water risks, making it exponentially more important for companies and for everybody really to be aware of water risks and to find ways to mitigate these. Next, please. So the good thing is the awareness on water risks is increasing, and so are the actions. I'm going to show you quickly what's happening in the corporate space. Next, please. So for one, we have the governments are commissioning water risk assessments to inform policy and investment decisions, which is relevant for companies because they're actually operating in these countries, right? So a water secure country is beneficial for the company actually wanting to operate in it. So we see governments increasingly being interested in understanding the water risks and finding solutions based on a solid analysis. Next, please. We also see companies becoming more and more interested in it. The companies are increasingly conducting water risk assessments for the operating sites and supply chains to understand what kind of targets they can set. Should they be contextual? Should they be company-wide? What can we do to actually mitigate identified water risks? And they're also using it for their marketing. So we've got a few older advertisements here, like no water, no beer from AB InBev. For every drop we use, we give one back. H&M for water, casually committed to restoring water. So we see for companies that are becoming aware that the stakeholders and the consumers are interested in them being good stewards, right? So they can use it for the marketing as well, if it's correct, obviously. So it's a double benefit for them to behave as good water stewards. Next, please. We're also seeing that companies are realizing that water risks are too complex to manage on their own. So if we have one company in one basin doing everything by the book, they're treating the wastewater, they have water efficient technologies and water stressed areas. However, if the neighboring companies are not playing game, they're investing a lot in mitigating and reducing the water risks they're exposing their environment to, but they're not getting any of the benefits, right? Because the companies next to them are polluting or over-extracting groundwater. So what they found was it's very important that all the companies and the government are all on board in reducing water risks to actually reap the benefits. So they've been starting to form coalitions. One of these coalitions is the Water Resilience Coalition from CEO Water Mandate. And they've got a couple of pledges, for example, being net water positive, which, the term itself, has a lot to discuss whether or not it's useful and how to measure it. But at least the intention is there to not impact water resources negatively. The other pledge is to have water resilient value chains. And the third pledge is to raise the ambition of water resilience through public and corporate outreach, meaning using the lobbying power of these companies, which have significant lobbying power, to actually drive the governments in which they're operating in to become more water secure. Next, please. And as soon as we have corporates acting in any space, we need to have some way of monitoring them. So we see an increase in disclosure, reporting, and accountability frameworks. For example, the mandatory ones, which are the EU CSRD, or in the US, the SEO. And we have a couple of voluntary reporting requirements like CDP, AWS, Global Gap, and so on, which are all intended to keep track of what the company is actually doing and whether it's credible and whether it's actually in the greatest good. And all of their benefits and disadvantages. Next, please. And the good news is that as it's a business, it has to make a business. It has to be a business case. It has to be financially. It has to make financial sense for the companies to actually invest in reducing water risks, right? And the good news is CDP showed us in a study that actually it does. And based on the companies which submitted their questionnaires, they found that the cost of inaction on water security is 5 times the cost of action. So if we look at the different sectors here in the horizontal axis, we can see that for all sectors, except for power generation, it is a lot more cost effective to mitigate the water risks than actually to wait until they're exposed to water risks. So the dark blue bar is the maximum potential financial impact if they ignore the water risk, and the light blue bar is the cost of response. So we see the cost of response is significantly lower across all sectors except for power generation than actually the cost they'd be exposed to if they ignore the water risks. That is a great business case to show the companies that actually it does make sense to look at water risks. Next, please. So we see that water risks are being considered, but they're not always assessed correctly. So the good news is, as I mentioned just now, the governments are commissioning water risk assessments to inform policy, planning, public investment. Companies are increasingly integrating water risk in strategy, operations, disclosure. We've got coalitions and reporting standards, formalizing expectations around water stewardship, which is great, a great advantage, a great step forward over the last 10 years. However, we see that now water risks are not really assessed properly. They're assessed too narrowly or incorrectly, and the key risks are overseen. And the global tools, which I'm going to show you in a second, also used beyond the design intent. And I hope after this presentation, we won't be misusing the tools. As a result of water risks not being understood properly, decisions are based on incomplete understanding of water risks, right? So that leads to costly investment mistakes. I might be building a plant in a water-stressed area, not taking it seriously like Tesla did. And I'd be using scarce resources which are not used to address the root problem, right? So as awareness around water risks increases, how water risks are being assessed is becoming really critical now. Next, please. So how do we look at corporate water risk exposure? Next, please. That's just a very quick introduction of how we do corporate water risk assessments. And I'm going to go in the next part of the presentation, like in the mistakes which can be done, which are being done, and how to avoid them. So typically we've got a multitude of sites. We might have 100 sites, 1,000 sites in a company, so we can't do a detailed risk assessment for each one of these sites, right? So we're going to prioritize these hotspots. We use water risk tools, questionnaires, headquarter insights to prioritize. In the second phase, we want to look at a second phase and third phase are in parallel, really. But we want to understand what is the inside the fence water risk assessment, meaning everything inside the operationals. We do that with site questionnaires and interviews. At the same time, we want to understand what is actually happening outside of the fence. And that's where we come in to help companies understand that, looking at everything, what are the water risks for the city? What are the water risks for the river basin? What's going on beyond, which is going to affect the company if they want it or they don't want it? Because it's not like the fence doesn't protect them from water risks, right? Protects them from many things, but not from water risks. And the fourth phase, we compare the inside the fence risk and outside the fence risks to understand the overall water risk exposure. Next, please. So I would like to share the 3 most common mistakes in assessing corporate water risks, which I see are being done by corporates or by consultants, and most importantly, how to avoid them. So moving forward, you're not going to make these mistakes to reduce significantly financial implications, but also just helping us to move towards water security by avoiding them. Next, please. So the 3 risks are assessing water stress alone leads to blind spots and false confidence. And I'm going to go into detail a bit later, so we're going to skip the small text. The second one is online water risk tools inform decisions or mislead them depending how they're used. And the third one, water risks are presented as an abstract risk, so they get ignored in decision making. And we're going to go into detail into each one of them now. Next, please. So first of all, yes, assessing water risks alone creates false confidence. Applying a multidimensional water risk assessment framework creates decision clarity. And what I found a lot was that the problem is not that water risks are too complex. is that most professionals just miss the right structure and guidance. And we're going to show you now how to not make that mistake. Next, please. So the false assumption behind most water risk assessments, which I see, is if we assess water stress, we have assessed water risk, which of course is a very dangerous assumption, which as you know, right? But the assumption feels reasonable because for most corporates or consultants, because it's very easy to understand. It's very easy to understand. If I don't have water, I have a problem, right? It's very widely used and accepted. And global tools make it easy to quantify and compare. And looks very technical, objective, and defensible. So if somebody who's got no idea of water comes and says we have to look at water stress alone, it seems like very plausible, right? But as we know, it's only one of many risk dimensions. And if we only look at water stress, it creates a very false sense of security if there's no water stress, right? And it creates blind spots for other risks. So incomplete assessments create false confidence. And even if the analysis looks great and rigorous. Next. And here's again, I actually wanted to do a quiz, which I guess we can't do now because I can't see you. But the point was that Singapore and Karachi, actually, if we only look at physical water risks, looking at water stress from the water risk tools, they actually have the same water risk score for water stress. So Singapore and Karachi would actually be exactly the same, face exactly the same risk exposure if we only looked at water stress. However, we know that in Singapore, we have tap water 24/7. It's very reliable. We don't have to worry about it. Whereas in Karachi, in Pakistan, we don't have 24/7 water supplies. It's highly polluted. We've got floods, we've got droughts, we've got infrastructure issues. We have everything you can imagine. And the distinction is governance. Because in Singapore, we've got very good water governance, which leads to very good water infrastructure. It actually manages the physical water risk experience through water stress. Whereas in Karachi, we've got very poor governance, which leads to very poor infrastructure, which leads to not mitigating and managing the water stress very well. So that comes to show like how important it is to look beyond water stress, because it's very different if you build an operation in Karachi versus in Singapore, right? Next. So to understand water risk fully and beyond just water stress, a framework is needed to guide the analysis. So without a framework, important risk dimensions are overlooked entirely. We have enormous amounts of time to disappear into research and rabbit holes, as I'm sure many of you have experienced these rabbit holes, without adding much insight into actual exposure. And as a result, you feel very uncertain, or the corporates are going to feel very uncertain if you actually understood the water risk exposure properly. And this is very unfair for decision making. You have to have decision clarity. But the problem is there's no universal public standard how to assess water risks. So we don't have it like for greenhouse gas emissions, how we know how to assess it. And most professionals are left to improvise. So they're using tools, like water risk tools, as a substitute for methodology, which we're going to look at in insight number 2, why that isn't a good idea. Next, please. So there is some high-level guidance on to look at location-specific water risks, but specific and practical guidance is missing on how to do that. So especially if we look at transboundary water risks, country water risk, river basin risk, city risk, which we have to understand the outside defense water risks for a company, right? There's no guidance whatsoever. We do have some guidance on how to do a site assessment with AWS, the Alliance for Water Stewardship, but also there's no guidance for supply chain. So we're pretty much left in the wild, wild west here. We have some high-level frameworks, which I'm going to walk you through in a second, from the UN, the World Bank, and the ADB, which all you've got the benefits and the flaws. Next, please. So the UN defines water security across 4 dimensions, which is drinking water and human well-being, ecosystems, water-related hazards and climate change, and economic activities and development. However, it doesn't give you any guidance on how to actually assess the dimensions, right? Which is a problem. Next, please. The World Bank Water Security Framework similarly gives you tells you to look across 3 dimensions, which is water endowment, basically physical risks, water infrastructure, and institutions, which is more water governance. But again, there's no guidance how to assess these dimensions. Next, please. And the ADB is the other extreme. They give you very detailed KPIs to look at across 5 dimensions. However, these KPIs are so specific on what you have to measure and what data you need that I haven't seen a single assessment anywhere in the world which actually managed to meet the criteria. So you have we've got huge gaps in analysis, but you wouldn't see it because you have the overall indicator KPI, which then looks like as if you have the information. So it's very misleading. So careful with the ADB KPIs. Next, please. So the consequence for the different projects we've done, when I was with PwC, working for the World Bank, and later on working for the World Bank directly as a consultant, I just started developing my own blueprint of how to assess water risks, because it was getting very overwhelming, very stressful, and to know exactly what to look at, or like very time intensive to kind of go into rabbit holes and getting lost in details, which I then realized it didn't add any value. And then we also adapted it for different multinational companies, just to make sure that it works for government clients and for corporate clients as such. I'm going to show you quickly how it looks like. Next, please. So with a blueprint, it goes across 3 dimensions. We learn what has to be assessed across physical, infrastructure, and governance risks. We learn how the physical infrastructure and governance risks impact each other, and where assumptions are acceptable and where they aren't. And then we also learn how to conceptualize water risk exposure for sites and cities within this framework. So let's have a look how this looks like. Next, please. So for physical water risk, this is only a very high level rundown, because we don't have much time, but you've got other resources of mine online, and just message me if you want to have more details. I can send you more. So we've got water stress, water pollution, and water-related disasters like floods and droughts for physical risk. And next. Just to stress one point here, that the biggest mistake I see is that people assume that available water, according to the data, is usable water. This photo is from a project we did in Hyderabad, this water is not usable water, right? It's foaming, it's toxic. You can't even touch it or go near to it, but you get burns from it. And it actually erodes bridges as well. So you couldn't use that. So it's very important to make the distinction between available water and usable water. Next. And just to highlight this report from the World Bank, it's a brilliant report, Quality Unknowns, Invisible Water Crisis, which I can highly recommend reading if you haven't read it yet, to look more into all the different dimensions of water risks around quality. Next, please. Yeah, the next dimension is water infrastructure risk, which we look at across 7 dimensions, focusing on the city level. So we look at everything starting from abstracting the water, treating the water, distributing the water to the users, how is it being consumed or used, how is it being then discharged as wastewater, is it collected, is it treated? So we're looking at the entire cycle. So we'll be looking at access to improved water supplies, water supply capacity, non-revenue water, access to improved sanitation, wastewater collection treatment capacity, aging infrastructure, and infrastructure at risk from terrorist attacks or from disasters. Next, please. And just to tell you, well, I'm sure you're aware of that, but just to highlight again, that oftentimes people think of all these water risks as a developing country problem or like a lower income country problem. However, we see that the US, as an example, is also struggling significantly with water infrastructure. And they've got this grading chart here. You can look at the entire report, it's actually very interesting. They've improved over the years, and now it's only a C overall rating. It was a C- for the last one, a D before. But we see like dams only have a D+, drinking water a C-, hazardous waste a C, inland waterways a C-, solid waste a C+, stormwater a D, wastewater a D+. It's a very poor score for a rich country, right? So it's becoming increasingly an issue for corporates operating in developed countries as well, including in European countries, with infrastructure is falling into disrepair. Next, please. Then we've got water governance, which in my opinion is the most important and the least looked at. Looking across 6 dimensions, looking at legal institutional framework, level of corruption, responsibilities and coordination across different ministries, across the national level, local level, and so on. And if anybody kind of coordinating all this, it's usually a huge mess. And usually people aren't coordinating it properly. Mobilizing finance, looking at efficiency of public expenditure and capacity across all different stakeholders. Next, please. And just to give you an insight on a project in Peru, how complicated it can get. So looking at legal and illegal abstractions, illegal abstractions are, as you know, a huge challenge in countries with weak regulation and enforcement. So one pump might be legal and having all the paperwork, but there might be another one hidden in the backyard, right? Or under a carpet. I've seen many crazy things. And government employees can be bribed to make illegal pumps legal on paper, right? And it's very difficult to see and discern which pumps are legal, illegal if you go there as a corporate to check your site, or if you're checking your supply chain. You can't really rely on certificates to ensure legal abstractions because of the above mentioned issues. And the best way forward is really to speak to local civil society organizations to ask them what's actually going on. But it was very fascinating and eager to understand the complexities of illegal abstractions and supermarket chains having the challenge of who do we actually trust, what can we believe, are we using products with illegal wells and abstractions, which it was very difficult to discern. Next, please. As to show like a note on responsibilities and coordination, this is in Indonesia for a project we did for the World Bank. A 3-year project actually, so we got into great depth, looking at the different management plans, which were not overlapping at all in terms of administrative units, right? We've got the river basin plans, which do not overlap with the groundwater management plan necessarily, which don't overlap with the irrigation management plan or the disaster risk management plan. So we've got like plans in different ministries, which are completely separate from the plans which would be really relevant for them. So you could be developing an irrigation strategy without having any information on the groundwater basin information, right? Which, yeah, has a huge amount of problems. So understanding like how are these plans actually coordinated is really important as well. Next, please. As a client example, as we're looking at corporates, I would just like to share very quickly, running a bit of time, at a client we had in Mexico. So there was a city in Mexico, not Mexico City, a smaller city, which is also running towards day 0. The factory had their own borewell, so they felt very safe in terms of we've got our own water supply, we're not dependent on the dysfunctional public water supply system, right? However, they're based in a very water-stressed area. And the city used to rely on groundwater, but because of massive over-abstraction of groundwater, the levels fell so deeply that they had to switch to having a reservoir and supplying the city with a reservoir water. Now what happened is the governance was very weak in that area, and there was a lack of financial commitment for operational maintenance of the dam. As a result, we've got the infrastructure risks. The dam fell into disrepair, which was the main water source for the city, as mentioned. So there was no more water supply from the dam, which is of course a huge problem. So it results in physical water risks. The city now exclusively dependent on groundwater again, and the groundwater levels dropped rapidly. So here you have the company feeling very independent from the public water supply system, feeling very exposed now to the falling groundwater tables as a result of everybody now using groundwater. So the pumps were running dry and the quality was deteriorating of the groundwater, and they had a huge water risk in any case, even though they felt they were independent. So it comes to show how interconnected all these risks are for a company. Next, please. So we've got significant uncertainties, as you know, in anything related to water. And applying theory to real life, just as a few guidelines for you, that no data doesn't mean no risk. And I usually add a section in my report with unknown risks, trying to quantify the impact of not knowing these risks. So if I don't have enough data on, let's say, heavy metal pollution in the groundwater, but I know there's mining activity upstream or next to the site, I would add an unknown risk section saying we've got this type of mining, which probably is going to result in this type of heavy metals in the groundwater. The government isn't monitoring it, but you should be monitoring it, right? So no data is not no risk. Then conflicting data from multiple sources. Try not to rely only on official data because it's not always correct, because we've got different incentives on why the government would not be disclosing everything fully. So try to complement it with or supplement it with government, with official data from academic resources or from looking at NGOs, what NGOs are saying and so on, to kind of balance the information. Forecasting into the future, always use scenario analyses, sensitivity analyses. You never know what's going to happen in the future, right? Especially if you have a bit shaky foundation in terms of data for the present moment. And stakeholder engagement is amazing to ground proof the insights you found. And each time I went on a project and actually had stakeholder engagement, or even better, went on a field visit, I'll be finding significantly more risks, understanding it and putting it into different contexts. So never discount the importance of actually being on the ground and speaking to people on the ground. And very important to be open to new views and humble that you don't know everything. Even after doing this for 16 years, every single assessment I do, I understand new things and I realize new things, especially how clever companies can be in avoiding regulation. Okay, next, please. Insight number 2, and I think we're going to be faster with insight 2 and 3, looking at the time. So water risk tools inform decisions or mislead them depending on how they're used. Next, please. So I'm sure you've encountered the water risk filter of WWF and Aqueduct from WI, and these are great tools. I use them a lot, and it's really contributed to understanding the water risks for corporates and making them more sensitive to it because it's easy to use. However, next, please. The bad news are that you can't use these free tools to assess location-specific risks. Yeah, and next. Why is that? Well, we've got limitations in the tools, which include they're using global data sets, which of course is the trade-off between breadth and depth. So we want to use a global data set to be able to look at compare every single site across the world, which means we have to use data sets which have data available across all countries, right? And across all locations, which means we have a very limited number of data sets we can use, and which aren't necessarily accurate on the local level, right? Then we're looking at sub-basin analysis, which makes sense to look at a sub-basin, of course, but the tools don't discern what the differences could be within a sub-basin. So if we look in Bangladesh, for example, if the central Dhaka shares the same sub-basin as rural Bangladesh, it would give me exactly the same risk score for both these locations. However, central Dhaka would have a very different risk exposure to rural Bangladesh, right? Central Dhaka would have issues with groundwater, over-abstraction, and all kinds of problems, actually. Every problem you can imagine. And rural Bangladesh would have maybe more wash problems or access to water supply overall. Very different. And the key issue is that these online tools don't consider key supply factors. So they don't consider water storage, dams and reservoirs, which of course are game changers in terms of the felt water risk exposure in the basin. They don't always use groundwater, at least not in the way which would be useful for you to understand the risks. They don't consider environmental flows. They don't include anything on water infrastructure. So what we mentioned before around water infrastructure isn't included at all. And it doesn't include any large-scale water import and export infrastructure like interbasin transfers, which of course can be a huge game changer. So next, please. As a result, to give you a few examples of what can happen, the water risk tools can tell us, for example, for site A, there's no basin stress, right? However, if we look on the ground and we understand what's happening, we see that there's a river transfer scheme diverting a significant amount of water resource to another basin. So the actual water risk, which is the exposure for the company, is very high basin water stress. We wouldn't know it just by looking at the tools. Or looking at site B, we have high basin stress based on the tool. However, looking on the ground, we see that we have a dam which buffers the interseasonal water fluctuations. So the felt exposure is very much a low basin water stress, right? So the incorrect assessment of water risk can lead to very costly mistakes for investments, corporate KPIs, and so on. I'm just going to move forward looking at the time. Next, please. So just to recap, the most frequent mistake I see for consultants and companies is that they only use these tools as the only means to assess site-specific water risks. It's not meant in a bad way. They don't have a method to do it in a different way, enough budgets, but just know that you can't do that. You can use it to prioritize sites as part of a large portfolio. You can use it for high-level regional global analysis, or but you can't really use it for understanding the water risk for a site, a city, river basin, or country level. For that, you need to do a more in-depth assessment, for example, using the blueprint I showed you before, or any other framework you have, which is similar. Next, please. So you can use the tools for prioritizing, as I mentioned. So you can have a very long list of locations, maybe thousands of sites. You use the online tools to prioritize them to have a short list. Once you have the short list, you can then go into detail with having site questionnaires and speaking with HQ what is important for them to then have an even shorter list. And then for these maybe top 5 or 10 sites, you can then do a location-specific assessment using the blueprint or using another framework. That's how you can use these tools, but never, 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 please never do that to use it as a site-specific water risk assessment. Okay, next, please. So this brings us to insight number 3. So water risks only drive action when they're framed for decision makers. Next, please. So even the best analysis can fail to influence decisions if it isn't presented in a way which decision makers can actually understand. And I think especially in academia or people who really value in-depth understanding of the issue, we sometimes forget that not everybody is as passionate as we are, and they just need to have a very factual, clear presentation of what the problem is. So oftentimes we present water risks in a silo, only looking at water risks, not looking at how they're connected to the possible risk or impact to the wider system. But what the decision makers really need is looking at what is the exposure I'm facing. Doing the right thing is rarely prioritized in corporates, and they only act once the risk becomes very visible and material. So if water risk isn't visible in the terms they understand, it won't compete with other priorities. So we need to look at what are the results of the assessment, how do we contextualize the results, and then how do we determine impact for the decision maker to understand what they have to do. Next. So how do we do that? How do we frame water risk to become decision relevant? Sorry, I've got 2 times become. So we want to move from water stress to, for example, for a corporate, explain like what is the operational disruption this water stress can cause, in as specifically as you can. For pollution, we could look at what is the loss of usable supply for our site, or what are the compliance risks we're exposed to. And for groundwater overuse, what is the long-term viability risk of even staying in the site? Do they have another plan B to get water, for example, the dam in Mexico? And then what is the risk of them not maintaining the dam? You know, so you have to look at is the location for the site actually a long-term good location, or do we actually have to expand and go to another place and yeah, kind of have that as a lost investment? So the ways to do it is to understand how the company works and what drives decisions is really important. And then framing water risk in terms of the processes, outcomes, and priorities that affect water risks, or that water risk can affect, is really significant. And once you do that, you really want to show how water risk already fits into the existing decision logic, rather than having the business case as such here, and you've got water here. You want to weave them together, so you where possible connect them to business plans and strategy. Next, please. And so one quick thing is that people usually say have a very strong focus on monetary impacts, as we mentioned before, very important. However, sometimes it's more impactful if we hit the emotional center of the brain. It's like a direct experience, and usually I'd be asking which one you find more impactful, but just feel into it. So if we read this text, more than 2 million Sudanese are at risk of the severe drought, and new fighting threatens the worst famine in the Sudan since 1988. If we read this text, just feel into it for a second. What do you feel? And if we go to the next slide, we see this photo of a starving child and a vulture, which was taken by Kevin Carter in 1993. And we can see, this poor child starved due to the drought, and a vulture waiting for this poor child to die that it can actually feast on it. So which the text or the photo would have a greater impact on you? And typically everybody always says, and I experience the same, the photo has a much bigger impact. Why? Because our emotional brain cannot comprehend the number 2 million. It doesn't matter if you say 10, 100,000, 200,000, 2 million, 20 million. Our brain can't comprehend the magnitude. However, if we see it in a case study like this, we can very much comprehend what is happening, and we might act. So sometimes you want to have the monetary data to show the impact. Sometimes you want to have the emotional component of a photo, a story, to show the impact. Next, please. So the way to come to this is really like this. You have the water risk assessment, you've got your results, you contextualize the results, looking at the basin risk and the site risk. Then you want to assess the impact. So what is the likelihood of operational disruption, for example? What is the potential revenue loss? You try to be as specific as you can. And if you can also add a specific case study or a photo, as mentioned just now, to drive the impact home, because some people are more rational with data, and some people are more emotional, looking at stories and pictures. Next, please. So quick recap. So to understand the true water risk exposure, water risk needs to be assessed across 3 dimensions. The physical water risk, infrastructure risk, and water governance risk. Just water stress alone creates a dangerous blind spot and false confidence. Then in the second insight, we learned that water risk tools can be used to save time and resources to prioritize high-risk sites for an in-depth assessment, but true water risk exposure cannot be determined with tools alone yet. So you always want to complement it with an in-depth assessment. And thirdly, water risks only lead to action when they're translated into decision-relevant, operational, financial, strategic consequences that decision makers can recognize and act on. Yes, so now I'm open for questions. If you'd like to go to the next slide, please. I think that was the last one. Yes. Okay, perfect. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out. It's my email address. If you want to do deeper trainings, we've got a few trainings. But for now, we've got the Q&A if you have any questions. But I'm not sure how we can do it because we can't see anybody, can we?
We do. They can either enter their questions in the Q&A or I think in the chat. It looks like people have access to that as well. So you're very welcome to put questions in there now for the audience. And Jennifer has very helpfully given her contact details too if people want to follow up and reach out to her after the call. I mean, thank you so much for that talk, Jennifer. There's so much in there to go through, and I think it's great to see how you're prioritizing action and recognizing the limitations of data, which is always a big challenge when we're trying to work on any any work really with governments at scale.
Mm-hmm.
I guess one of the things for this audience that might be nice to reflect on is, for those who are starting their careers, there's a question in the chat, are the trainings free? But I think more, I'll let you answer that one later as well. But
Yeah.
I should point out that's from one of our MSc students. But yeah, is there a reflection you have for those who are starting out their careers in the sector about what you think is important for them to think about in terms of taking this sort of thinking around water risks forward?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so first of all, the trainings, I've got a free training, so you can message me. It's a 1.5 hour training, which goes more into depth than I do here, but the other trainings do have a fee. But so in terms of what I found extremely relevant was looking at water risks as a systems risk, which is basically what we do when we look at the different dimensions, how they impact each other and the different stakeholders involved, which I also found great in the master program we did, Katrina, is that actually the EU prepares very, very well for the real world context of showing us the interdisciplinarity of water risks and the different stakeholders involved, the different angles we have to look at. So I think being very aware of the importance of that is really critical, because I found most people I encountered who didn't take this master program weren't quite aware of the interconnections across different sectors, across different approaches, across different areas and regions and stakeholders, so they came to very different conclusions and approaches than I did, or people I spoke to from the master program, because we just had the benefit of being exposed to the great different topics which we learned. So I think being aware of water being highly complex and involving everything you can imagine is always very relevant and helpful.
Okay, thanks very much. There's no questions appearing in the chat, but I'm conscious that others will have. There was one come through on the Q&A. Can you see the Q&A panel? So it says,
yes, we see.
I've heard from the CEO, water mandate has been going through transformation over the last couple of years and hasn't put out new information recently. Do you see this body as an effective way to champion water stewardship, action on risk, or will collective action look different in the future?
Okay. So they are actually active working, and they just did develop the 100 priority basins for companies to kind of agree on for collective action, because the problem was that they had too many locations, so they couldn't decide where to start. So they had an assessment to choose the top 100 priority basins recently, using that forward to kind of dense action places, which have benefits and disadvantages, but that's something they did. I mean, otherwise, I don't want to say too much about how good their work is or not, but I think it's great. The initiative of them just being aware and bringing different companies together in itself is very valuable. And if they then act as part of the CEO water mandate or independently, it's really secondary, as long as they do something. Another good organization for collective action is the Alliance for Water Stewardship, and they just shifted to having areas like similar to the CEO water mandate, focusing on different hotspots. So they've been creating, how do they call them, impact accelerators, I think, in different cities, where they found many of the members being present with either direct operations or supply chain, where they just bring them together to help them organize themselves. Because the problem we face now is some suppliers have, some companies have suppliers in similar locations, others don't. But you really have to find a way to match the company which wants to take action with other companies which want to take action, which in itself is difficult, right? And then match the ones which have the same exposure in the same locations, right? So you want to find all the companies being exposed, for example, in Dhaka, in looking at textile, right? And then take a step forward in Dhaka. So it's quite a challenge of getting collective action to work in practice. Another one, which isn't called collective action, but I found very, very interesting how it works, is the 2030 Water Resources Group. If they do multi-stakeholder platforms, which is basically the same as collective action, just the old-fashioned word for it. And that was really great, seeing how that really moved things forward. Not necessarily what you could see in publications, but seeing the government and the private sector and civil society sitting together in one table, speaking about what the actual problems are, and what is blocking them from moving forward with solutions really made a big difference, because the companies are in their own mindset. They don't know where the government's problems are. The companies are not with the government, and they just never talk with each other, right? So having a platform where they can talk is really hugely beneficial. So I think collective action is the way forward. It's got many challenges in how it can be done. Is it the CEO water mandate? Is it AWS? Is it 2030 WG? I don't know, but it might be a completely different organization. But overall, like having the notion of companies working together collaboratively compared to just being competition is a great step forward. And I guess you have to be patient in how that actually plays out in future.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We are at the hour, so we should close down the webinar now. Thank you so much for your time. I'm sure you'll have a few of our students coming to follow up with you on other questions, and hopefully we'll get a chance to bring you to Oxford soon, so that
Yes, that would be
you can
lovely.
meet with them in purpose. But there's
That would
lots
be
of
lovely.
comments coming through still. Just saying thank you, and so very much from myself and from Oxford Water Network, thank you as well. And just a reminder that Oxford Water Network also has a drinks on tomorrow night for those of you who are in Oxford, and you can find out more on the website, or the information is there for the social tomorrow night. And next Tuesday we have a talk by Dr. Marielle Snell from Solidarities International, who's been working in Yemen on women, water and systems change, insights and actions from the wash field. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Katrina, and I wish you could join the drinks. It sounds lovely. In the King's Arms. Nice. Have a lovely time.
Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.